It began as a ghost on film, a grainy, indistinct shape captured from the cold vacuum of space, appearing on light tables deep within Langley, Virginia, throughout 1968 and 1969. At the Sudomek shipyard in Leningrad, something was stirring. The photographs revealed vast, windowless halls rising from the earth, structures larger and more shielded than any submarine shed ever documented in the Soviet Union. Western intelligence analysts, their faces illuminated by the pale glow of magnified images, saw a puzzle taking shape. The heat blooming from the site, captured by infrared sensors, was the deepest part of the mystery. It burned with an intensity that defied the logic of steel. This was not the familiar fire of conventional welding. This was something else entirely. Something hotter. Something alien. Whispers from the shadows, pieced together from the fractured memories of defectors, gave the ghost a name. Project 705, the Lyra. The fragments spoke of a revolution, a vessel that would shatter every known paradigm of submarine design. But the claims were so audacious they were dismissed as fantasy, as Soviet disinformation designed to provoke and mislead. The world's leading naval architects, when consulted, were unequivocal. The engineering was impossible. A hull constructed entirely of titanium? The metal was notoriously brittle, a nightmare to weld, a task for a jeweler, not a shipyard that spanned hundreds of acres. To attempt it on the scale of a submarine was to invite catastrophic failure. The power source they spoke of was an alchemist's dream, a liquid metal heart. A reactor cooled by lead bismuth, ferociously corrosive and lethally toxic, yet promising a power density the West could only imagine. And the crew, a skeleton force of just 30 men. To command such a beast would require an artificial nervous system, an automation so advanced it bordered on science fiction. It simply did not exist. The consensus in the quiet, wood-paneled offices of Western intelligence was clear. The Soviets were bluffing. Their industry, plagued by poor quality control and lagging technology, could never produce such a machine. Their existing submarines were loud, unreliable, crude instruments compared to the silent, sophisticated hunters of the U.S. Navy. Project 705, they concluded, would be a spectacular failure. A monument to hubris, rusting in a forgotten corner of a Leningrad dock. But 3,000 miles away, in the gilded halls of the Moscow Admiralty, the reality was far more terrifying. The plans laid out by the Rubin Design Bureau were not a proposal. They were a challenge to the laws of physics themselves. This was to be a hunter forged not from steel, but from the very metal of spy planes and spacecraft. Powered by a contained star, a reactor so dense it could propel this underwater predator faster than any torpedo ever built. The analysts in the West saw an anomaly. A puzzle in black and white. They saw a problem of engineering. They failed to see the truth. This was not an experiment. It was the forging of a weapon designed to rewrite the rules of undersea warfare. A silent predator, born from an impossible metal and an unthinkable fire, was taking shape in the Leningrad darkness. In the silent, pressurized depths of the Cold War, the deep ocean was an American lake. Its silence was broken only by the whisper of their nuclear submarines, vessels that moved with a quiet confidence born of technological supremacy. They possessed superior sonar that could hear an enemy from leagues away. Their hulls were quieter, their weapons more precise, their numbers overwhelming. For the Soviet Union, this was not merely a strategic disadvantage. It was a fundamental imbalance that threatened to render their entire nuclear deterrent obsolete. For one man, Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, the iron-willed commander-in-chief of the Soviet Navy, this was an intolerable equation, a problem not of engineering, but of existence. To compete conventionally was to invite ruin, a costly arms race they could not win. The solution, he believed, lay not in matching the enemy, but in invalidating their every advantage. A new kind of weapon was needed, a ghost, a predator so far beyond the known rules of engagement that its very presence would rewrite the art of underwater warfare. The vision was audacious, bordering on fantasy. A submarine that would carry a crew of just 30 men, a feat made possible only through a level of automation never before attempted. It would move with the speed of a torpedo, capable of exceeding 40 knots while submerged, fast enough to outrun the very weapons designed to destroy it. And it would dive to the abyssal depths, approaching 2,000 feet, a sanctuary far below the crush depth of its American pursuers. This was not to be just another submarine. This was Project 705. A single vessel of this kind could paralyze an entire fleet. A handful could hold the North Atlantic hostage, forcing NATO's war planners to question every assumption, every doctrine, every sonar contact. The strategic uncertainty it would create was a weapon in itself, worth far more than the sum of its torpedo tubes. Within the guarded halls of the Soviet Naval Command, the idea was met with a storm of opposition. Pragmatists saw a machine of impossible expense, each unit costing multiples of a proven nuclear boat. The technical risks were monumental. Entire industrial facilities for fabricating titanium would have to be built from nothing. The automation systems were theoretical, requiring years of painstaking development. The reactor was a dangerous, unproven concept. They argued for practicality, for investing in what worked. But Gorshkov's vision, backed by his immense political capital, refused to yield. In 1968, Project 705 was given the official sanction of the state. The shipyard at Severodvinsk began a radical transformation, preparing to build a vessel that defied the known limits of physics and engineering. The price, measured in human effort and risk, began to mount immediately. The submarine's hull was to be forged from titanium, a metal as strong as steel but nearly half the weight. Yet it was a notoriously difficult material. To weld it was to court disaster. The metal was so reactive that a single stray molecule of oxygen or nitrogen could create a brittle, catastrophic flaw. The solution was extreme. Entire sections of the Severodvinsk facility were turned into hermetically sealed chambers, the air itself purged and replaced with a dense atmosphere of pure argonever. When applied on this scale, every single weld, glowing with an otherworldly light in the inert gloom, had to be flawless. A single microscopic imperfection could compromise an entire section of the hull. A mistake measured in millions of rubles and the lives of a future crew. The work was slow, unforgiving, and saturated with an invisible tension. Deeper within the design, at the very heart of the impossible submarine, lay a challenge of alchemical proportions. A compact, high-power reactor was needed to generate the colossal energy for its speed. The answer Soviet engineers had pursued since the 1950s was a liquid metal coolant. They chose an alloy of lead and bismuth. It was a brilliant choice on paper, offering incredible thermal efficiency. But in practice, it was a devil's bargain. This molten metal, this ferocious, toxic river flowing through the submarine's veins, was violently corrosive. It devoured steel piping, demanding exotic new alloys to contain it. And it was intensely poisonous to human beings. A leak would be a death sentence. To tame this demonic heart, to build a machine around it that could withstand the crushing blackness of the deep, was the ultimate test. Every weld, every pipe, every sacrifice was a price paid for a phantom. A weapon forged not just from titanium and lead, but from the brutal calculus of fear. In the remote, closed facilities of the Urals, the first whispers of a new power were carried on the wind. Early reactor tests were not going smoothly. A litany of failures plagued the prototypes: coolant chemistry that refused to stabilize, pipes that bled corrosion, and radiation shielding that proved tragically insufficient. The price of this new science was paid first by human bodies. Technicians, sworn to secrecy, began to develop mysterious illnesses. Their systems accumulated heavy metals, their health silently collapsing from the inside out. Some died. Their medical records vanished into classified archives, their families given a sterile, unbelievable explanation: reassignment to a distant, unreachable post. Their bodies became the first unacknowledged casualties of a technological ghost. By 1971, that ghost took physical form. Western intelligence satellites, their electronic eyes sweeping over the Soviet Union, captured something extraordinary emerging from the shipyards of Severodvinsk. A submarine, designated K-64. Its shape was wrong. Smaller than the lumbering nuclear behemoths they were used to seeing, with hull lines that were sharp, aggressive, almost alien. A single, powerful propeller suggested a design philosophy built entirely around speed. The images sparked quiet, intense debate in the hushed halls of NATO intelligence. Assessments were cautious. The conclusions were risked on a full production class. A one-off curiosity. The alternative, the idea that this was the production model, that the Soviets had actually mastered the near-impossible art of welding a titanium hull, remained a fringe theory. A minority opinion whispered by analysts who saw not an experiment, but the future of undersea warfare. Far from prying eyes, in the restricted waters of the Baltic, K-64 began its trials. Soviet engineers pushed every system to its breaking point, discovering a machine of profound contradictions. The liquid metal reactor was a marvel. It performed brilliantly, a compact, ferocious heart that delivered an almost unbelievable torrent of power. The titanium hull was its equal, an armored hide of immense strength, capable of diving to depths that would instantly crush a conventional steel submarine into a twisted coffin. Its automation systems, once debugged, allowed for a crew a fraction of the normal size. And its speed was breathtaking. It could accelerate to 42 knots, sustaining a velocity that other submarines could only dream of in brief, engine-straining sprints. It was a predator, built for the chase. But for every triumph, a hidden flaw festered. The lead bismuth coolant, the very lifeblood of the reactor, was a demanding master. It had to be maintained at a temperature above 125 degrees Celsius. Always. Even when the reactor was shut down, auxiliary heaters had to run continuously, consuming precious power, adding layers of mechanical complexity. To let it cool was to let it solidify, turning the reactor's core into a useless radioactive brick. The advanced automation was temperamental, a network of delicate nerves that required a new breed of highly trained technician to soothe and maintain. And the small crew, once a point of pride, became a point of extreme vulnerability. A single serious injury, one critical equipment failure, and the submarine was left dangerously short-handed in the most hostile environment on Earth. At high speeds, its acoustic signature, while an improvement, still screamed its presence to the sensitive ears of Western sonar arrays. It was fast, but it was not silent. The arrival of the second boat, K-316, in 1972, confirmed the most dangerous flaw of all. The liquid metal reactors, so potent and powerful, were devouring the submarine from within. The coolant was far more corrosive to the intricate network of piping than any laboratory test had ever predicted. The chemistry had to be managed with obsessive precision, monitored constantly, a delicate balancing act to prevent the vessel's own veins from dissolving. The same unseen decay that had claimed its creators now stalked the creation. The program, born in the secret illnesses of men in the Urals, had produced a machine that was, itself, chronically, and perhaps fatally, ill. In the silent, crushing dark of the Norwegian Sea, a new sound began to haunt the Cold War. It was a whisper at first, a fleeting anomaly on a sonar screen, a ghost in the machine. Throughout the early 1970s, NATO submarine crews, the undisputed masters of the deep, started logging encounters that defied their understanding of physics. Contacts that appeared from nowhere, moved with impossible velocity, and vanished into depths their own vessels could never reach. These were not the familiar signatures of Soviet submarines. They were something else entirely. A predator, moving at speeds approaching 40 knots. An agile phantom, diving past conventional limits, maneuvering with a ferocity that seemed alien. The reports were often brief, dismissed by analysts back on shore as sensor glitches, strange ocean currents, or even the overactive imaginations of crews spending too much time submerged. But the ghosts kept appearing. The whispers grew louder. The data points began to form a terrifying pattern, suggesting a secret weapon was now prowling the depths. A vessel that could not, and should not, exist. The moment of chilling clarity arrived in late 1971. A NATO submarine, patrolling its designated sector, did not just glimpse the phantom, it locked onto it. For the first time, a prolonged sonar contact was achieved. The acoustic data was captured, preserved, and rushed to the specialists at the Naval Underwater Systems Center. There, in sterile laboratories, the ghost was given a name, and its capabilities were laid bare. The analysis was staggering. The contact had maintained speeds between 38 and 42 knots for over an hour. This wasn't a brief burst of acceleration. This was sustained, relentless speed, a performance that exceeded any known Soviet submarine by a factor of 2. The report traveled through secure intelligence channels, triggering a cascade of urgent reassessments. The disbelief within Western naval commands slowly curdled into a cold, hard dread. Project 705, a shadowy Soviet program long considered too ambitious, too technologically fraught with risk, had succeeded. It had produced a submarine that ripped up the rulebook of undersea warfare. The Alpha class. Its design was a monument to brutalist engineering genius. A hull forged not from steel, but from incredibly strong, lightweight titanium, allowing it to dive to depths where no powerful engine that gave the Alpha its unprecedented speed and agility. Soviet engineers had achieved what Western experts had openly dismissed as impossible. The strategic implications were catastrophic. The entire architecture of NATO's anti-submarine warfare was suddenly obsolete. The Mark 48 torpedo, the apex predator of American undersea weaponry, had a maximum speed of 55 knots. This was barely a comfortable margin against the Alpha's sustained speed, and potentially slower than the Soviet submarine during its acceleration bursts. A weapon designed to hunt could now be outrun. The underwater battlefield was redrawn in an instant. At depths below 1,500 feet, NATO submarines were operating at the very edge of their structural limits. The Alpha could descend to 2,000 feet with ease, treating it as a sanctuary from which to strike, or a refuge into which it could simply disappear. The hunter had become the hunted. A shockwave of humility coursed through the naval establishments of the West. The deep ocean, a domain they had controlled for decades through technological superiority, was now contested territory. A Soviet submarine that could outrun their best torpedoes and dive beyond their deepest pursuit represented a capability gap that would demand years of research and billions of dollars to close. The psychological toll on the crews was profound. Submariners who had sailed with the quiet confidence of technological certainty now faced an adversary that was fundamentally faster, deeper, and more elusive. The silent service was now haunted by a very real fear. Yet the Alpha was a flawed masterpiece. Its revolutionary systems were incredibly demanding. The liquid metal reactor required constant specialized shoreside maintenance, meaning the submarines spent nearly as much time tethered to port as they did at sea. It was a severe limitation for a vessel intended to challenge global naval dominance. But even with its faults, the Alpha's existence had changed everything. It was a ghost story made real, a phantom born of titanium and atomic fire that forced an entire generation of naval strategy back to the drawing board, forever altering the silent war waged beneath the waves. In the silent, pressurized world of the Cold War, a terrible price was being paid. Not in rubles, but in human life. Deep in the Arctic gloom of Zapadnaya Litsa, at the Alpha Maintenance Facility, a silent poison was seeping into the veins of the men who served. Their blood carried elevated levels of lead and bismuth. Their bodies were failing them. Medical examinations, buried deep within classified archives, revealed a grim catalog of kidney damage, neurological decay, and cancers that bloomed with an unnatural aggression. Some men were quietly retired, their careers erased by medical disability. Others simply vanished from the records, their deaths officially attributed to causes far removed from the truth of their work. The source of this affliction was the heart of a revolutionary new weapon, a ghost in the machine. The Soviet Project 705, the Alpha-class submarine, was powered by a liquid metal reactor, a volatile molten metal heart that pulsed with immense power, but which gnawed at the very arteries of the submarine, corroding its pipes from within. The lead-bismuth coolant was a volatile alchemy, its chemistry almost impossible to control. Chronic maintenance failures plagued the fleet. Operational readiness rates stubbornly refused to rise, sometimes falling below 50%. These were brilliant, flawed beasts, requiring specialized facilities and a priesthood of technicians who were always in short supply. Yet the assembly lines did not stop. Despite the staggering cost in lives and resources, Soviet naval leadership demanded more. Between 1971 and 1981, 7 of these predators entered the water. K-64, K-316, K-432. Each one costing approximately 3 times that of a conventional nuclear submarine. Each one a strategic gambit, a calculated sacrifice. The true purpose was not merely to build a better submarine, but to force the West into a frantic, ruinously expensive technological arms race. To sow strategic uncertainty, to make NATO question everything it thought it knew about the depths. And it worked. By 1976, the full impact of this strategy became terrifyingly clear. The Alphas began to hunt. In the dark, frigid waters of the Norwegian and Barents Seas, American and British submarine commanders filed after-action contact. An impossibly fast signature. Then, nothing. Frantic attempts to maintain a track would fail, the target simply vanishing into the abyss. These were not sailors' tales. These were verified contacts, achieving sustained speeds of 40, even 45 knots. They could dive to depths that made pursuit a suicidal fantasy. A cold dread settled in the control rooms of Western submarines. Training exercises confirmed their worst fears. Simulated torpedo launches against targets moving at Alpha-class speeds were exercises in futility. The weapons were too slow. The hunters had become the hunted. They were facing a threat they could not track, could not catch, and could not kill. The silent corrosion that ate away at the reactor pipes in secret Arctic bases had manifested as a corrosive fear, spreading through the highest echelons of NATO command. The poison that flowed through the veins of Soviet technicians had become a poison in the mind of the enemy. A hidden cost for a very public and very terrifying result. In the cold, silent depths of the ocean, the hunter became the hunted. The weapon designed to ensure Western naval supremacy, the Mark 48 torpedo, was a marvel of engineering. A guided missile that swam, capable of tracking and destroying the quietest of Soviet submarines. It was the apex predator. But against a new shadow emerging from the Soviet shipyards, it was suddenly, terrifyingly, obsolete. This new threat moved at speeds previously thought impossible, diving to crushing depths with a waltz of conventional submarine warfare simply couldn't niche into the abyss. A fundamental law of underwater combat had been broken. For decades, NATO doctrine was built on a simple, comforting assumption. To find was to kill. If a submarine could be detected, it could be engaged with a high probability of success. The Soviet Alpha-class submarine tore that assumption to shreds. Even when it appeared as a fleeting contact on a sonar screen, it could simply outrun any torpedo fired at it. It could dive beyond the operational limits of its pursuers. The equation no longer balanced. Detection no longer meant destruction. For the commander of a NATO submarine, an encounter with an Alpha was a moment of profound helplessness. A ghost on the screen. A high-speed acoustic signature that defied belief. The choice was stark. Launch a futile attack, revealing your own position for nothing, or accept the cold, hard reality that you were hopelessly outmatched. The mission would shift from hunting to mere observation, a passive witness to a new master of the deep. This tactical crisis rippled upwards, reaching the highest echelons of power. In the secure briefing rooms of Washington and the strategic headquarters of Brussels, the questions were no longer about weapon performance. They were existential. For generations, NATO had compensated for the Soviet Union's sheer numbers with a decisive technological edge. Western submarines were quieter. Their sensors were sharper. Their crews were better trained. This technological superiority was the bedrock of confidence, the guarantee that the vital sea lanes of the Atlantic could be kept open. The Alpha-class submarine shattered that confidence. It was a testament to a different kind of engineering philosophy, one that embraced radical, almost reckless innovation. While the West refined, the Soviets leaped. They built hulls from titanium, a costly and difficult material that allowed for incredible depth and speed. They powered these boats with daring liquid metal-cooled reactors, compact and immensely powerful, a technology the West had deemed too risky. The result was a vessel that rewrote the rules. The full scope of the crisis crystallized in a series of classified intelligence briefings through late 1976 and early 1977. The data presented to NATO commanders was sobering. At least 4 operational Alphas were already at sea. More were on the way. This wasn't a prototype. It was a fleet. A capability gap had opened, and there was no quick way to close it. Upgrading the Mark 48 would take years. Designing a NATO submarine that could match the Alpha's speed or survive its operational depths would take a decade, perhaps more. The strategic implications were chilling. The Soviet Union's fleet of ballistic missile submarines, their ultimate nuclear deterrent, had always been most vulnerable near their home bases. To reach their patrol areas in the open Atlantic, they had to run a gauntlet through the Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom gap. This choke point was laced with NATO's most advanced listening devices and patrolled by its deadliest hunter-killer submarines. But now, the Alphas could act as high-speed escorts, guardians for the lumbering missile boats. A wolf pack of untouchable predators, capable of sweeping ahead, clearing a path, and engaging any NATO asset that dared to interfere. The weapon that was meant to guarantee control of the seas was now a relic of a bygone era. And in the silent, crushing dark, the hunters had to confront a terrifying new reality. They could also be the hunted. The Cold War had a unique geography. A silent, invisible world beneath the waves, where the fate of nations was decided by shadows and whispers. For years, the West had held a quiet supremacy in this domain, but a new predator was stalking the deep, a ghost forged from titanium. The Alpha. Suddenly, the strategic calculus was shattered. The Soviets now possessed the ultimate guardian for their nuclear-armed submarines. An escort so fast, so deep-diving, it could hunt the hunters. A single Alpha-class boat, a phantom of liquid metal and raw power, could engage and neutralize multiple NATO attack submarines, holding them at bay while its precious cargo slipped through the net. It was a tactical checkmate. The deep ocean, once a reliable defensive barrier for the West, was transforming into a contested battleground, a killing field where the old rules no longer applied. The response from NATO was a jolt of cold panic, echoing through the highest corridors of power. It manifested as a frantic, multi-pronged race against the clock. The Mark 48 ADCAP torpedo program, once a steady development project, was supercharged with emergency funding. Timelines were torn up. This was no longer about incremental improvement. It was about creating a silver bullet. The new weapon had to be a monster in its own right, capable of screaming through the crushing blackness at 65 knots. It needed the endurance to dive to depths exceeding 3,000 feet, pushing the very physics of underwater propulsion to its breaking point. In laboratories humming with the silent urgency of the Cold War, engineers at the Naval Undersea Warfare Center worked ceaseless shifts, chasing impossible numbers, wrestling with guidance algorithms and pressure-resistant materials. But killing the Alpha was only half the problem. First, you had to find it. Existing sonar systems were built for a different era, a slower, more deliberate hunt. They relied on operators patiently building a track, connecting faint acoustic dots over time to reveal the presence of a slow-moving submarine. The Alpha made a mockery of this process. It could tear through a sonar's entire detection envelope before a human operator could even classify the contact. A flash of noise, a whisper, gone. The solution demanded a new kind of perception. Advanced signal processing, predictive algorithms, and a massive leap in computing power were needed not just to hear the target, but to think ahead of it, to anticipate its impossible speed and plot its course before it vanished back into the abyss. At the shipyards of Electric Boat and Newport News, the ultimate question was asked. To fight a monster, must you become one? American submarine designers were tasked with evaluating the feasibility of creating their own Alpha. The technical studies came back with a sobering conclusion. It was theoretically possible, but practically a nightmare. The titanium construction alone would require an industrial revolution in miniature. Entirely new fabrication facilities would have to be built. A generation of workers would need to be trained in exotic welding techniques that did not exist in American industry. The cost would be astronomical. Billions of dollars for a specialized infrastructure that would serve only a handful of vessels. And then there was the heart of the beast, the liquid metal reactor. This was the source of the Alpha's terrifying power, but it came with the devil's bargain. The technology was volatile, unforgiving. For the United States Navy, with its peerless and hard-won nuclear safety record, the risks were deemed unacceptable. The immense shielding requirements, the complex maintenance, the constant danger of personnel exposure. It was a philosophy of performance at any cost, one that was fundamentally incompatible with American naval doctrine. So, America chose a different path. Not revolution, but evolution. Instead of mirroring the Alpha's brute force, they would refine their own art of submarine warfare. The formidable Los Angeles-class submarines would become the foundation for a methodical, incremental counter-strategy. Their sonar systems would be enhanced, their electronic ears trained to hear quieter targets at greater distances. Their own propulsion systems would be further silenced, making American boats even harder to detect, true masters of the stealthy approach. And their weapons would be steadily improved, eventually providing the reach and speed needed to challenge a high-speed threat. It was a conservative approach, a patient game. It was a bet that a smarter, quieter predator could still defeat a faster one. The underwater war would not be won with a single revolutionary machine, but through a relentless pursuit of perfection, turning the silent service into an even more lethal ghost in the deep. Beneath the waves, two philosophies of power were locked in a silent, cold war. One was a doctrine of relentless, incremental perfection, proven systems, refined over decades, built for endurance and reliability, the American way. The other was a gamble, a breathtaking leap into the unknown, forged in the fires of ideological urgency. This was Project 705, the Soviet Alpha class, a weapon designed not to endure, but to dominate, to be faster, deeper, and deadlier than anything the West could imagine. But a revolution in technology often carries the seeds of its own destruction. While the Alpha program terrified NATO strategists, inside the secret naval bases of the Soviet Union, a far more intimate and corrosive battle was being waged. The 7 Phantoms, constructed between 1971 and 1981, were proving to be as fragile as they were fast. Their flaw was elemental. At their core beat a heart of molten metal, a liquid lead-bismuth coolant, a design of staggering genius, allowing for a compact, powerful reactor. It was also a design of staggering difficulty. Under operational conditions, controlling this volatile lifeblood became a nightmare. Every surge of power, every change in speed, sent thermal shocks shuddering through its veins, stressing the intricate network of pipes to their breaking point. Impurities, invisible to the naked eye, bloomed within the coolant, accelerating a creeping internal decay. The very lifeblood of the submarine turned against it, eating away at the machine from within. The specialized naval yards at Zapadnaya, Litsa, and Gremika, once symbols of Soviet industrial might, became triage centers in a desperate, unending war against physics. The numbers told the story of profound failure. A conventional Soviet nuclear submarine was a dependable asset, ready for deployment 60 to 70% of the time. The Alpha class, the pinnacle of their engineering, was a ghost in its own fleet. Its operational availability rarely climbed above 50%. Sometimes it plunged below 40%. This was the brutal calculus of the Cold War. A submarine that spends more time chained to the pier than prowling the depths is not a weapon. It is a monument to a failed investment. Soviet naval planners were forced to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth. Their 7 revolutionary submarines offered less real-world capability than 3 or 4 of their older, more reliable counterparts. But the true cost was measured not in rubles, but in human lives. The men tasked with maintaining these beautiful, broken machines were paying a terrible price. Handling the lead-bismuth coolant, even with protocols meant to protect them, was a dance with an invisible poison. Medical monitoring programs began to detect a silent, creeping horror in their blood tests. Elevated levels of heavy metals settled deep in the joints. A fog that clouded the mind, for some, irreversible kidney damage. The Soviet Navy's medical service documented every case, filing the reports away in classified archives. A secret ledger of sacrifice, not to be unsealed until the empire itself had crumbled. This was the price of the revolution. And yet, this flawed, fragile predator achieved its ultimate mission. It succeeded not by what it did, but by what it represented. To the west, the Alpha was a specter of impossible speed and depth, a threat that could appear from nowhere, strike, and vanish before a response could even be formulated. Fear is a powerful catalyst. NATO poured billions of dollars into countering a ghost. The Mark 48 ADCAP torpedo program, a marvel of engineering in its own right, was accelerated specifically to hunt the Alpha. Sonar systems were redesigned. Naval doctrine was rewritten. Entire training regimens were overhauled. All of this for a phantom fleet of just 7 vessels. Less than 5% of the entire Soviet submarine force. It was a weapon that inflicted its deepest wounds on its own creators. A strategic masterstroke, born from a catastrophic operational failure. The Alpha class stands as a monument to an engineering philosophy that prized the single, brilliant breakthrough over sustainable, reliable power. A ghost that haunted the West, but whose truest legacy was the quiet, human price paid in the shadows. A chilling reminder that in the quest for ultimate power, the first casualty is often the one standing closest to the fire. In the cold, dark depths of the Atlantic, an illusion was shattered. For decades, the silent service of the West had owned the crushing dark, confident in its technological dominion. Then, a ghost appeared on their sonar screens, a phantom that moved with impossible speed. The psychological shockwave sent through NATO's submarine forces was profound. It was a sudden, chilling realization that their supremacy was not a law of nature. It was a privilege that could be revoked. This new humility bred a deep-seated caution, a strategic shift that would define undersea operations for the entire 1980s. The source of this anxiety was the Soviet Project 705 Lyra, known to the West as the Alpha class. Throughout the decade, these titanium predators stalked the northern patrol routes, operating from their heavily fortified fleet bases. Encounters were fleeting, terrifying, and almost ritualistic in their pattern. A whisper on the hydrophones, a contact too fast to be real. Then, a burst of unearthly acceleration as the Alpha executed maneuvers that would tear a conventional submarine apart. It would plunge into the abyss, far below the operational depths of its pursuers, and simply vanish from every sensor. The chase was over before it had even begun. For NATO submariners, the rulebook was rendered obsolete. Training exercises became desperate attempts to solve an unsolvable equation. The tactics they developed were not plans for victory, but acknowledgments of their own limitations. A direct, one-on-one engagement was a fantasy. The Alpha held every advantage. Perhaps a coordinated ambush, a volley of torpedoes from multiple directions, could overwhelm its defenses. Perhaps a strategy of area denial, seeding the ocean with patrols, could fence the predator out of critical zones. These were theories born of necessity, gambits against a foe that defied convention. In the quiet rooms of naval intelligence, the hunt took on a different form. Every fleeting contact with an Alpha became a priceless intelligence windfall. Sonar operators became scribes, capturing every nuance of the submarine's acoustic voice. They recorded the unique signature of its liquid metal-cooled reactor, the cavitation patterns of its propeller spinning at incredible speeds. the hydraulic groans of its control surfaces during high G turns. Analysts worked feverishly, searching the data for a crack in the Titan's armor. And slowly, vulnerabilities began to emerge. The Alphas were fast, but they were not silent. At flank speed, the sound of water shearing across the titanium hull and the violent boiling of water around its propeller created a detectable roar. They could dive deeper than any other vessel, but to reach those crushing depths without risking hull failure, they had to bleed off their speed significantly. They could outrun any torpedo in the arsenal, but they could not sustain that sprint indefinitely. The strain on the machinery was immense. The weaknesses were there, but exploiting them required new weapons, new tactics, new ways of thinking that were still years from deployment. The most significant vulnerability, however, was not in the metal, but in the flesh. The Alpha's crew was just 31 men. An astonishing feat of automation, but a critical flaw. On long patrols, watch schedules were stretched to their breaking point. Fatigue, a silent killer in the deep, became a constant companion. Any equipment failure, any injury, any casualty left the submarine dangerously short-handed. Intelligence gathered from defectors and intercepted signals confirmed this. Alpha crews were the elite, trained longer and held to a higher standard than any others in the Soviet fleet. But they were still human. A Western boat, with a crew of over 100, could absorb losses and continue its mission. An Alpha, with its skeleton crew, could not. A single serious blow to its personnel would compromise the entire vessel. The ultimate irony was that this pinnacle of Soviet engineering, this machine built to dominate the ocean, was tethered to the frailties of the men inside. The ghost in the deep had a human heart. And it was this realization that finally brought the Phantom back to Earth, transforming it from an invincible monster into a complex, brilliant, and ultimately fallible machine. The illusion of Western invincibility had been shattered, but in its place grew a more sober, more intelligent understanding of the true nature of power beneath the waves. A machine built to be invisible had developed a rhythm, a predictable, fatal pulse. Deep within the naval yards of the Soviet Union, the Alpha-class submarines, titans of the deep, were slaves to their own complex design. Their revolutionary liquid metal reactors demanded constant, meticulous care, creating a pattern that eyes in the sky began to trace with cold precision. Intelligence analysts, piecing together satellite imagery and faint signal intercepts, learned to read the silence. They could distinguish the quiet hum of a maintenance cycle from the deep void of an operational deployment. This was the first crack in the armor of a legend. This knowledge transformed the hunt. NATO could now conduct its own deadly symphony, adjusting patrol patterns and surveillance priorities with newfound confidence. Resources were concentrated when the Alphas were at sea, a net of sensors and hunter-killer submarines tightening across the North Atlantic. Coverage could relax when the boats were confirmed in port, their volatile hearts being tended to by legions of engineers. The ghost of the depths was being tethered to a schedule. By the early 1980s, the West's understanding of the Alpha had matured. The myth was giving way to mathematics. The submarines remained formidable, their speed and depth capabilities still a source of profound concern. But they were not invincible. Their chronic operational availability problems meant that the force of 7 submarines existed more on paper than in the crushing blackness of the ocean. Far fewer were ever at sea at any given time. The high-speed performance that made them so terrifying also made them loud, leaving a distinct acoustic signature. For the NATO submariners who had once spoken of the Alpha with a near superstitious dread, the psychological landscape was shifting. Fear was being replaced by a more nuanced assessment. These were no longer supernatural vessels, immune to the laws of physics and warfare. They were dangerous adversaries, to be sure, demanding respect and extreme caution. But they were machines, and machines could be broken. The technological response was also coming of age. In the mid-1980s, a new weapon entered development testing, a silver spear forged for a single purpose. The Mark 48 ADCAP torpedo was engineered to do what was once thought impossible: to hunt an Alpha in its own element. With a maximum speed of 65 knots and a depth capability of 3,000 feet, the ADCAP could finally pursue the Soviet submarine through its entire performance envelope. A direct hit was never guaranteed against such an agile target, but the nature of the engagement was fundamentally transformed. What was once hopeless became merely difficult. At the same time, improved sonar systems on newer American submarines were providing better detection ranges, their electronic senses piercing the gloom deeper and with greater clarity. The final blow, however, came not from a torpedo, but from within. The Soviet Union's cascading economic problems of the late 1980s accelerated the Alpha program's decline. The immense cost of maintaining 7 technologically complex submarines, each plagued with chronic reliability issues, became an unsustainable luxury for a Navy facing catastrophic budget pressures. One by one, the Alphas were withdrawn from active service, their titanium hulls destined for the scrapyard. K-64, the very first boat completed, was decommissioned in 1974 after just 3 years, its reactor problems proving too severe to overcome. Then, the inherent danger of their design was laid bare. On the 24th of August, 1982, while operating in the Norwegian Sea, the submarine K-123 suffered a catastrophic reactor accident. A loss of coolant pressure allowed the molten lead bismuth to partially solidify inside the reactor's core. The lifeblood of the machine turned to stone, entombing the reactor and ending the submarine's operational career. 3 crew members lost their lives. And early 1990s, the very technology that had promised unmatched performance, the beating liquid metal heart of the Alpha, had revealed itself as its most profound and unforgiving flaw. It was a predator that had, in the end, consumed itself. In the silent, crushing depths of the Barents Sea, the heart of the machine faltered. This was no ordinary engine. It was a volatile, superheated core of liquid lead bismuth, a technological marvel that promised unprecedented speed and power. Emergency protocols were initiated. Auxiliary systems, designed as the last line of defense, were called upon to restore the vital flow of coolant. They failed. A cascade of errors, both Hu-team explosion ripped through the reactor's steel womb, a blast of scalding vapor and invisible poison. 3 men would not survive the ordeal, their lives extinguished by superheated steam and a lethal dose of radiation. Against all odds, the wounded submarine, K-123, limped back to port, a steel ghost returning from a battle it had lost against itself. The incident was a tragedy, but it was also a confirmation, a brutal validation of the fears that had haunted nuclear safety experts for years. The liquid metal reactor, the very soul of the Alpha-class submarine, was a double-edged sword. A technology that demanded perfection and punished anything less with brutal finality. The official inquiry, its findings shrouded in secrecy for years, peeled back the layers of the disaster. It revealed a truth far more disturbing than simple mechanical failure. The problem was systemic. The Alpha's revolutionary design, which allowed for a drastically smaller crew, had created a new kind of vulnerability. Reactor operators, the guardians of the nuclear fire, were pushed to the edge of human endurance, working through exhaustion on long, grueling watch rotations. Their training, while intensive, could never fully simulate the split-second life-or-death calculus required when the machine began to scream. The very automation that made the small crew possible had become a ghost in the machine, introducing novel ways to fail when its own logic collapsed. But secrets in the Cold War rarely stayed buried for long. The silent watchers in the West pieced together the whispers of disaster. Listening posts intercepted faint, desperate communications crackling across the Arctic. Satellites, cold eyes in the blackness of space, captured imagery of the crippled submarine returning to its frozen sanctuary. Analysts noted its sudden, prolonged absence from naval deployments. The accident provided Western intelligence with invaluable insight. The Alpha was fast, a phantom of the deep. It was also fragile, a thoroughbred that could break its own leg. This knowledge reinforced their assessment. The Soviet Union had built a magnificent weapon, but one that carried profound operational risks. By 1990, the fleet of Phantoms was already fading. Only 2 Alpha-class submarines remained in service, their patrols limited, their systems plagued by a lack of spare parts and endless maintenance backlogs. The collapse of the Soviet Union a year later was the final, decisive blow. The new Russian Navy, inheriting a vast and decaying arsenal, lacked the colossal resources needed to maintain these exotic, expensive predators. The last Alpha was formally decommissioned in 1996. It marked the end of a 25-year history, a chapter in which no more than 7 of these vessels had ever been active at one time, yet had forced the entire NATO alliance to completely rethink the art of submarine warfare. The end of its operational life was not the end of its danger. The decommissioning process unveiled one last, treacherous challenge. The liquid metal heart that had given the Alpha its life now refused to let it die peacefully. The lead bismuth coolant, solid at room temperature, had to be painstakingly removed and stored as hazardous waste, a complex procedure for which no standard protocol existed. The reactor compartments themselves were intensely radioactive, requiring extensive, costly decontamination. For years, some of the Alpha hulls sat rusting in shipyards, toxic specters awaiting a final burial that the state could not afford. Even their revolutionary titanium hulls, a treasure trove of valuable metal, defied recycling. The very structure of the submarine had been poisoned, the metal itself contaminated by its long proximity to the nuclear core. The Alpha-class submarine, conceived as the ultimate undersea hunter, a creature of unmatched speed and silence, had met its final fate. It had become a permanent liability, a silent, radioactive tomb. The story of a weapon does not end when its metal grows cold. Its true legacy is not measured in steel, but in the echoes it leaves behind, in the strategies it rewrites, in the lives it changes, and in the shadows it casts on the future. The submarines of Project 705 were more than machines. They were a shock to the system of global power, a ghost in the deep that would haunt the world's navies for decades. For the West, the appearance of the Alpha class was a technological reckoning. Assumptions of superiority, built over years of steady, predictable progress, were shattered in an instant. The response was a frantic, multi-billion-dollar scramble, a desperate race to counter a threat that defied known rules. Sonar systems, once thought to be the all-seeing eyes of the ocean, were suddenly rendered insufficient. Torpedoes, the undisputed predators of the abyss, were now too slow. Naval tactics, honed through 2 world wars and the long twilight struggle of the Cold War, were torn up and rewritten. Resources that could have shaped entire fleets were diverted, consumed by the singular obsession of hunting this one impossibly fast submarine. The Alpha forced an evolution, not through battle, but simply by existing. Within the Soviet Union, the project's influence ran deeper still. The immense challenge of building an all-titanium hull had forged a new generation of metallurgists and engineers. They had learned to tame a notoriously difficult metal, transforming it from an aerospace novelty into a core component of naval power. The welding techniques, the quality control, the specialized facilities built in secret cities, this hard-won expertise did not vanish when the last Alpha was retired. It became the foundation for what came next. The DNA of Project 705 was passed down, its titanium bones forming the skeletons of the formidable Aquila and Sierra-class Sioux. At the heart of the Alpha was its most brilliant and most cursed innovation, the liquid metal reactor. A compact, ferociously powerful lead-bismuth core that promised performance conventional reactors could only dream of. It was a genuine leap into the unknown, a marvel of nuclear engineering. It was also a maintenance nightmare, a corrosive, unforgiving beast that demanded constant attention. Yet the dream of its potential never died. Even as the Alphas were decommissioned, Russian designers continued to chase the phantom of a perfected liquid metal system, convinced they could solve the riddles of corrosion and reliability that had plagued the original. Lessons learned in failure became the blueprints for future ambition, a technological quest that continues to this day. But the price of this ambition was paid in human currency. For the men who tended these volatile reactors, the danger did not end with their service. The lead-bismuth coolant, the very lifeblood of the submarine, was a slow, invisible poison. Years after the Cold War faded into memory, a pattern of illness began to emerge among the veterans of the Alpha maintenance crews. Medical studies documented the silent damage: kidney disease, neurological disorders, rare cancers. A tragic postscript written in hospital records, confirming the long-term risks that had been an open secret within the program. Their safety protocols had been a shield, but a shield full of holes. They were heroes of a secret war and casualties of their own cutting-edge technology. The psychological impact rippled through both men's professional pride. They were a breed apart, masters of a uniquely demanding and dangerous machine. They knew its flaws, its risks, its temperamental nature. To serve on an Alpha was to prove you were among the elite. For the Western sailors who tracked them, the experience was formative. An encounter with an Alpha was a story told for an entire career, a lesson passed down to younger generations. It taught them that the enemy was not just a reflection of their own technology. It taught them that a determined adversary, willing to take radical risks and pay any price, could change the very nature of the game. The Alpha-class submarine was, in the end, a paradox, a stunning success and a costly failure. It was a weapon that reshaped the thinking of its enemies more than it ever threatened them in combat. Its true power was not in its torpedoes, but in the questions it forced the world to ask. It was a testament to the fact that the most profound legacies are not always forged in victory, but in the relentless, dangerous, and often tragic pursuit of the impossible. The encounters were ghosts, whispers in the deep that defied the known laws of naval warfare. For years, they shaped tactical thinking, breeding a new kind of operational caution that would linger long after the last of these predators was decommissioned. They were a fascinating, terrifying case study in the art of military technology and the brutal chess game of strategic competition. The Soviets had achieved something staggering. They had built operational submarines from titanium, a metal notoriously difficult to weld and shape. They had made liquid metal reactors work at sea, a feat of engineering that bordered on science fiction. They had created automated systems so advanced they reduced crew requirements by half, turning a complex war machine into a silent, streamlined hunter. The result was a performance that Western navies simply could not match, a phantom that could outrun their torpedoes and outdive their deepest fears. if engineering did not automatically translate to operational success. The immense costs, the crippling maintenance problems, and the severely limited availability meant that 7 Alpha-class submarines provided less actual combat capability than a larger fleet of conventional boats. Their revolutionary reactors, hearts of molten lead bismuth, required continuous heating even in port, consuming vast energy and demanding constant, vigilant monitoring. The coolant chemistry had to be controlled with microscopic precision to prevent the pipes from corroding from within. These were brilliant but fragile beasts. Their true impact was never measured in tactical victories. It was measured in the reaction they provoked. By forcing NATO to confront a revolutionary capability, Project 7005 achieved objectives far beyond any single operational deployment. It was a strategic masterstroke. Western navies spent billions developing countermeasures. They tore up their doctrines and rewrote the rules of engagement. They were forced to question every comfortable assumption they held about undersea combat. The program was a stark demonstration that radical innovation and a willingness to accept immense risk could create strategic effects entirely disproportionate to the size of the force involved. The answer, when it finally came, was a weapon born from a decade of humiliating encounters. The Mark 48 ADCAP torpedo entered full operational service in 1988, a full 17 years after the first Alpha-class submarine completed its sea trials. This weapon was the embodiment of every lesson NATO had learned. A maximum speed far exceeding 65 knots, a depth capability that could reach over 3,000 feet, improved guidance algorithms designed specifically to track a high-speed, maneuvering target, and an enhanced propulsion system that could sustain the chase long enough to exhaust the endurance of even an Alpha. The cost was immense. The torpedo was nearly twice as expensive as the original Mark 48, and its development program had consumed over $1 billion. But for American submarine commanders, it was priceless. They finally possessed a weapon that could credibly threaten the undersea demons that had haunted their operations for a generation. Yet, by the time the ADCAP reached the fleet, the threat it was designed to kill was already fading. The immense economic pressures on the Soviet Union were forcing difficult choices across all military programs. Maintaining 7 technologically complex submarines with chronic reliability problems became indefensible when conventional boats could be operated for a fraction of the cost. The Ghost was receding, not defeated by a silver bullet, but by the slow, inexorable drain of a collapsing empire. The encounters that had once sent shockwaves through the Pentagon became echoes, memories of a challenge that had reshaped the very nature of the fight beneath the waves. In the silent, frozen ports of the Soviet North, the hunters were falling still. The feared Alpha-class submarine, a phantom of the deep that had once terrorized NATO naval planners, was succumbing not to a worthy adversary, but to a slow, internal decay. A force of 7 boats, each a pinnacle of underwater technology, was meant to project unparalleled power. The reality was a fleet crippled from within. Specialized maintenance crews were a ghost workforce, chronically in short supply. Operational availability rates rarely climbed above 50%. This meant that on any given day, the vastness of the world's oceans was patrolled by barely 3 of these titanium predators. The rest were ghosts, tethered to the pier, bleeding resources. Western intelligence watched the decline unfold, piecing together the story from a mosaic of silent observations. From the cold vacuum of space, unblinking eyes in orbit tracked the submarines, noting their ever-lengthening stays at Zapadnaya Litsa and Gremikha. Whispers captured from the ether, routine signal intercepts, spoke not of mission readiness, but of crippling maintenance backlogs and a constant, desperate shortage of parts. The most damning evidence came from the men themselves. The hollowed-out figures who slipped of glory, but of endless waiting. They described boats that spent more time awaiting critical repairs than they ever did conducting patrols beneath the waves. The terrifying high-speed encounters that had defined naval warfare in the late 1970s became whispers, then legends. By the mid-1980s, an encounter with an Alpha was an anomaly. When they did occur, intelligence analysts poring over acoustic signatures and hull markings often identified the same boat, one of a dwindling few conducting multiple consecutive patrols. The evidence was irrefutable. Only one or two Alphas remained truly operational, while their sister ships sat silent, consumed by their own complexity. The end began not with a bang, but with a quiet, bureaucratic signature. In 1987, K-377 was the first to be decommissioned. Its volatile reactor heart, a source of immense power, had become a chronic, untenable liability. 3 years later, in 1997, had finally degraded beyond the possibility of economic repair. The fall of the Soviet Union sealed the fate of the rest. In 1992, with the new Russian Navy facing the harsh realities of a collapsed economy, K-373 and K-493 were withdrawn. Maintaining such exotic, demanding machines was an impossible luxury. The final two, K-463 and K-316, limped through reduced operational schedules until 1996, when they too were finally retired. The era of the Alpha class ended in silence, a quiet surrender to economics and the unforgiving laws of physics. Yet their story was far from over. The death of a nuclear submarine is a complex, dangerous process. But the Alphas presented a challenge of an entirely different order. Standard procedure called for defueling the reactor and dismantling the hull. For the Alphas, this was merely the beginning. Their metallic lifeblood, the lead-bismuth coolant, could not simply be drained. It had to be painstakingly removed and stored as a toxic, hazardous waste, a venomous legacy that would endure for generations. The reactor compartments themselves were deeply contaminated, irradiated by years of direct exposure to the liquid metal. They required extensive, dangerous decontamination before any dismantlement could even be considered. And the hulls, those magnificent titanium shells, theoretically worth a fortune in recycled metal, had absorbed low-level radiation over their service lives, complicating any effort to process them. So they waited. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, the great titanium husks sat in Arctic shipyards, silent monuments to a bygone era. They languished as funding for their final disposal never materialized, their internal poisons a ticking clock. Eventually, growing environmental concerns over the stored lead bismuth and the incompletely decommissioned reactors would prompt international assistance. The Hunter, once a threat to the world, had become a threat to the planet itself. The ultimate predator, designed to haunt the silent deep, was now a silent ghost on the surface, poisoned from within by the very technology that made it so formidable. The Cold War's most dangerous ghosts were not laid to rest easily. Decades after the last of the Soviet Union's deadliest Hunter submarines was retired, their nuclear hearts continued to beat. A silent radioactive threat sealed within their steel hulls. It wasn't until the 2010s, nearly 40 years after the first vessel slipped into the Arctic waters, that the final reactor compartments were dismantled. This monumental task was funded, in part, by the very Western nations that had once lived in fear of these machines. A strange alliance born of shared anxieties. Anxiety over environmental catastrophe and the terrifying possibility of nuclear materials falling into the wrong hands during Russia's chaotic New Dawn. But the true legacy of this program was not sealed in lead-lined containers on the floor of the Kara Sea. It was etched into the very bones of the men who gave it life. For years, Soviet-era classified studies had predicted a grim future for the maintenance crews of Project 705. These were warnings whispered in secret, then filed away and forgotten. Then, in 2004, the whispers were given a voice. A comprehensive study, published in Russian medical journals, founded on the liquid metal reactor systems at Zapadnaya Litsa, the Alpha's home base, between 1972 and 1996. The findings were a brutal confirmation of decades of rumor. Compared to their counterparts who serviced conventional submarine reactors, these men suffered from catastrophically higher rates of kidney disease, neurological disorders, and specific, aggressive cancers. The science was chillingly precise. Blood tests, conducted decades after their last exposure, revealed elevated levels of lead and bismuth. The heavy metals they had breathed and touched had not left their bodies. Instead, they had become a part of them, accumulating in bone tissue, only to leach slowly, inexorably, back into their bloodstreams for the rest of their lives. A slow-release poison, administered by the state they served. The final tally was stark. 43 deaths directly attributed to heavy metal exposure. Another 72 cases of permanent, crippling disability. They had been young men when their service began, most in their 20s and early 30s, sent to tame a revolutionary and profoundly dangerous technology. Many would face their own mortality while still in their 40s and 50s. The Soviet Navy's compensation was a bitter insult. Meager disability pensions and limited medical care for ailments the state officially refused to acknowledge as service-related. After the Soviet collapse, even these small comforts vanished into the maelstrom of economic crisis. Some sought justice. They filed lawsuits against the Russian Navy, demanding accountability for their shattered health. The cases dragged through a labyrinth of Russian courts for years, ensnared in legal paradoxes. Could a new government be held liable for the secrets of an old one? Could the state be blamed for hazards that were classified at the very moment of exposure? The answer, for most, was no. A few cases ended with small, quiet settlements. The vast majority were dismissed or simply left to wither in legal limbo. Yet, while the men who built the Alpha were forgotten, the machine itself was not. In the submarine warfare communities of NATO, its memory remained intensely vivid. The officers who had once tracked this silent predator through the depths rose to the highest ranks, their experiences shaping the future of naval strategy. The lessons learned from hunting the Alpha were woven directly into the fabric of Western military doctrine, driving advancements in sonar technology and redesigning the very torpedoes meant to kill it. The human cost of Project 705 was not measured in immediate casualties. It was a debt that came due over decades, paid in shortened lives and chronic suffering. For the West, the Alpha became a strategic lesson, a ghost in the machine that forced a generation of innovation. For the men who touched its radioactive heart, it was simply a tomb, one they carried inside them, long after the submarines themselves had been silenced forever. In the silent, pressurized classrooms of American submarine schools, one ghost haunted the curriculum. Its name was Alpha, a Soviet specter that taught a brutal lesson. Technological surprise could shatter a generation of strategic certainty. The encounters became mandatory case studies, grim illustrations of how a comfortable technological lead could vanish overnight, and why the race for innovation never, ever ends. The postmortems conducted within the intelligence community were just as intense. Long after the Cold War thawed, declassified Central Intelligence Agency studies peeled back the layers of a profound failure of imagination. Why had the West been so blind? Why, in the face of mounting evidence, did analysts refuse to believe? The findings pointed to a series of deep-seated biases. There was the fatal assumption of mirror imaging, the belief that Soviet industry bled from the same wounds and faced the same constraints as its Western counterparts. There was a deep-seated refusal to credit an adversary with a genuine, paradigm-shifting breakthrough. And then, the simple, grinding force of institutional inertia. A resistance to rewriting the maps of power, even when the ground beneath was clearly shifting. These studies became required reading for new analysts, cautionary tales written in the ink of past mistakes. Yet the most critical students of Project 705 were its own creators. The Akula-class submarines, slicing through the waves of the 1980s, were the answer to the Alpha's brilliant, impossible question. They were a masterclass in learning from flawed genius. The lessons were forged into new steel and titanium. Automation was improved, but not at the expense of human oversight. Acoustic quieting was pushed to new frontiers. Titanium was used not with abandon, but with a surgeon's precision, strengthening critical components, shedding weight without incurring crippling costs. Most crucially, they tamed the beast. The Akula's designers traded the raw, untamed power of liquid metal for the steadfast reliability of conventional pressurized water reactors. They sacrificed a measure of sheer performance for something far more valuable: safety and operational readiness. They automated systems, but maintained crews larger than the Alpha's skeletal 30-man complement, acknowledging the limits of machine autonomy in the unforgiving depths. The result was a predator that carried the Alpha's spirit, without its fatal flaws. The complete titanium hull. But they married this revolutionary construction to proven conventional reactors and larger crews. The Sierra was a testament that the dream of an all-titanium hull was not a fantasy. It could be made practical, reliable, and deadly, if divorced from the other extreme gambles of Project 705. The proof of that vision endures. 2 Sierra boats, born from the Alpha's ghost, still serve in the Russian fleet into the 2020s. The mastery of titanium fabrication, a hard-won expertise from Project 705, had a life of its own. The liquid metal heart of the Alpha was abandoned, but never entirely forgotten. Even today, proposals for advanced Russian designs periodically surface, referencing improved lead-bismuth systems, promising to finally solve the corrosion and maintenance plagues of their ancestor. The Alpha itself was a paradox, a machine of terrifying potential, crippled by its own ambition. It was a spectacular failure and an undeniable success. A ghost in the machine of naval history, whose lessons echo long after its revolutionary engines fell silent. A shadow lingers over the silent depths of naval engineering. It is the ghost of a machine that defied the very laws of its era, a predator forged from titanium and powered by a molten metal heart. Even today, the promise of that technology, the compact, ferociously powerful liquid metal reactor, remains a dream deferred. Modern reactor designs boast superior corrosion-resistant alloys, meticulously controlled coolant chemistry, and advanced automation. Yet, as of the year 2024, not a single operational Russian submarine dares to harness its volatile power. The technology is a specter, confined to research papers and cautionary tales, a breakthrough never quite trusted enough to send back into the cold, crushing dark. The West watched, and the West learned. The shockwave from Project 705, the Alpha program, rippled through the design halls of American shipyards for decades. When the Virginia-class submarines began slipping into service in the 2000s, they were more than just new vessels. They were an answer to a question posed by a rival who had refused to play by the established rules. Their extensive automation, their dramatically reduced crew sizes, their almost supernatural acoustic quieting, these were not mere evolutionary steps. They were features born from the chilling recognition that an adversary could, at any moment, achieve a leap in capability that would demand an immediate, overwhelming response. Inside these new hunters, modular weapon systems allowed for rapid reconfiguration, a tactical flexibility driven by the hard-learned lesson that technological surprise is a constant threat. The entire design philosophy was a testament to an institutional memory seared by the sudden appearance of the Alpha. Strategic analysts pored over the history of Project 705, dissecting it as a masterclass in asymmetric competition. The Soviets had looked at the board, at the sheer industrial and technological might of NATO's submarine forces, and understood they could not win a conventional fight. So they chose not to fight one. They pursued a radical alternative, a concept so audacious it forced their adversaries to react on unfavorable terms, to spend fortunes countering a threat they had never anticipated. The Alpha program may have ultimately failed to achieve sustainable operational success. Its service history is a litany of crippling malfunctions and logistical nightmares. But in the grand, silent chess match of the Cold War, it accomplished its most vital strategic objectives. It sowed deep uncertainty within Western naval commands. It forced a massive expenditure of resources to track, understand, and counter its existence. And most critically, it served as a stark, titanium-hulled reminder that technological supremacy is never permanent. That lesson echoes in strategic planning to this day, shaping the response to any potential adversary who might pursue a similarly asymmetric path. When the cold, hard numbers were finally tallied, the economic reality of the Alpha program was sobering. Each of these underwater phantoms cost approximately 3 times the price of a contemporary Victor III class submarine, the reliable workhorse of the Soviet fleet. The maintenance costs were even more staggering, running an estimated 5 times higher. Operational availability hovered around a meager 45% compared to the 65% of its conventional nuclear counterparts. A simple calculation reveals a stark truth. The vast resources invested in the 7 Alpha-class submarines could have built and operated a fleet of approximately 15 Victor III-class boats. At any given time, the Alpha flotilla might have provided an effective force of just 3 submarines at sea. That alternative fleet of 15 Victors, however, would have kept nearly 10 submarines on patrol. From a pure cost-effectiveness standpoint, the gamble of Project 705 was questionable at best. A ghost that demanded a king's ransom, not just to build, but simply to exist. The strategic value of a weapon is never measured in numbers alone. It is measured in the silence it creates in an enemy's command center, in the cold sweat on a sonar operator's brow. For a generation of NATO submariners, that silence and that fear had a name. It began as a ghost, a whisper on the hydrophones, a contact that defied the laws of underwater physics. Western crews would track it, lock on, and then watch in disbelief as the target simply accelerated. It moved with a velocity that belonged to aircraft, not submarines. It didn't just evade their torpedoes, it outran them with contemptuous ease. The feeling was not one of being outmaneuvered. It was a sickening, tactical helplessness. The chilling realization that you are the prey, and the hunter is something beyond your comprehension. This phantom of the deep was Soviet Project 705. Known to its crews as the Lyra, and to a terrified West as the Alpha. It was less a submarine and more a submerged fighter jet, a machine born from a completely different philosophy of naval warfare. Its hull was not steel, but a shell of immensely strong, impossibly expensive titanium. Its heart was not a conventional reactor, but a compact, lead-bismuth-cooled fast reactor, pulsing with liquid metal. A design so advanced and so dangerous, it operated on the very edge of metallurgical science. This radical engineering allowed for a vessel of unprecedented automation. The crew was not the standard 130 men. It was a skeleton force of just 31 officers and warrant officers. Aboard an Alpha, there were no passengers. Every single man was a vital component in a complex, unforgiving system. Survival depended not just on your own competence, but on the flawless performance of every other soul sealed within that titanium tube. There was no redundancy. There was no margin for error. Veterans who served on these underwater predators would later speak of a unique sensory world. The constant, ethereal hum of the liquid metal pumps, a sound that existed nowhere else on Earth. The faint, distinctive metallic smell of the ionized air inside the titanium hull. And above all, the feeling of acceleration. A visceral, physical force that no other submariner had ever experienced, pinning men to their stations as their vessel surged through the abyss. They spoke of a fierce pride in operating such a machine, a pride shadowed by the constant, gnawing anxiety of commanding a system that demanded absolute perfection. The shockwaves from these deep-water encounters rippled through the war rooms of the West. The Alpha became a technological catalyst, an invisible hand pushing Western sonar and torpedo development into overdrive. Programs that had been proceeding at a measured pace were suddenly given unlimited resources, driven by the urgent need to counter a threat that intelligence agencies had previously dismissed as impossible. Soviet engineering, often perceived as crude and lagging, had demonstrated a capacity for radical, paradigm-shifting breakthroughs. The West was forced to reevaluate everything it thought it knew about its adversary. The engineers who conceived and built the Alphas would reflect on their creation with a complex mixture of pride and regret. They had accomplished something truly remarkable. They had willed into existence a machine that pushed multiple technologies to their absolute limits. But they also understood the hidden costs, the brutal maintenance schedules, the operational nightmares, the sheer fragility of a design so far ahead of its time. Some wondered if more conservative choices might have yielded a more practical, reliable weapon. Others insisted that radical innovation was the only path forward, the only way to leapfrog the West's material superiority. In the end, the Alpha's greatest adversary was not a new American torpedo or a breakthrough in British sonar. It was the inexorable decay of the system that gave it life. As the Soviet economy crumbled, these magnificent, terrifying machines became too expensive to maintain, too complex to operate. The threat that had haunted the oceans for over a decade simply faded away. Western forces felt a profound relief, tinged with the bitter recognition that their technological response had arrived too late. History, not engineering, had defeated the Alpha. The oceans grew quiet again. But for those who had heard it, the memory of that sound, the sound of an enemy moving at impossible speed, would echo for a generation. A chilling reminder of a time when a ghost roamed the depths, a ghost forged from titanium and fire. In the frozen shipyards of the Arctic, they lie silent. Ghosts of titanium, bleeding rust and radiation into the permafrost. For decades, their final judgment has remained unsettled, a story told in two irreconcilable halves. These are the remains of Project 705, the Soviet submarine class known in the West by a single, chilling name: Alpha. To the analysts who tracked its shadow from beneath the polar ice cap, the Alpha was a breathtaking failure. A technological marvel that burned too brightly, too quickly, a fascinating dead end. For the strategists who conceived it, the truth was different. They saw a resounding success, a weapon that achieved its mission without ever firing a shot in anger. A fleet of just 7 vessels that redrew the map of undersea warfare and forced an entire alliance to question its dominance. Both stories are true. The Alpha was an act of sheer will, a violation of every cautious principle of naval engineering. It was a vessel built from a metal more common in supersonic aircraft, powered by a reactor that flowed Decious assets. A silver predator that could outrun any torpedo and outdive any opponent. It was the physical manifestation of Soviet ambition, proof that raw, determined innovation could shatter an opponent's technological advantage. The response from NATO was a tidal wave of spending. Billions of dollars poured into new weapons, new sensors, new tactics, all to counter a 7-submarine force. The Alpha created a lasting, gnawing uncertainty in the minds of Western naval commanders, a fear of the unknown, a deep respect for an adversary capable of such a radical leap. But this leap came at a terrible cost. The very innovations that made the Alpha magnificent also made it a curse. Its liquid metal heart, a source of unprecedented power, was a radiological nightmare for the crews and the shipyard workers tasked with its maintenance. It poisoned the men who kept it alive. The program consumed a nation's treasure, resources that could have built fleets of conventional, reliable submarines. In the end, it was simply unsustainable. A triumph of engineering that became a harrowing cautionary tale about the true price of radicalism. Decades after the last Alpha was decommissioned, its legacy endures in these Arctic graveyards. The titanium hulls that once sliced through the abyssal deep now sit inert, their radioactive contamination a permanent barrier to recycling. The liquid metal reactors, drained and dormant, are monuments to a technological dream that decades of research could not save from the simple, relentless realities of corrosion. The revolutionary automated systems, which allowed a crew of just 30 men to operate a nuclear attack submarine, were stripped out and studied. Their genius was absorbed into later designs, but their soul, their operational purpose, became a museum piece. The machine is gone. But the idea of the Alpha, the idea is immortal. It lives on in military doctrine, in weapons development, in the institutional memory of intelligence agencies. It is a permanent warning against the danger of mirror imaging, the fatal assumption that your adversary thinks. Today, in the 2020s, a new generation of submarine warfare officers studies the declassified records of Alpha encounters. They learn hard lessons about technological surprise. Intelligence analysts still invoke Project 705 as the ultimate example of an adversary's unconventional thinking. Engineers still pore over the faded schematics, examining the exotic welding techniques and reactor designs, searching for a spark of insight. The admirals who once laughed in their wood-paneled offices, dismissing the early intelligence's fantasy, are long retired or gone. Some later admitted their error, a lesson learned about the perils of underestimating an opponent. Others held firm, arguing that skepticism is a commander's duty, and that it is better to be wrong on occasion than to chase every shadow. What remains is the silence of the shipyards, and the hulks themselves. They are not merely scrap. They are a memorial, a testament to an impossible machine and to the chilling, ever-present question that it carved into the future of warfare. What else is out there, moving silently in the deep, that we believe to be impossible? The silence of the deep ocean holds its secrets close. For years, one of those secrets was a ghost, a whisper that defied the laws of physics and chilled the blood of Western naval intelligence. The debate it ignited, A fierce clash over technological surprise and the fog of espionage would echo for decades. But for the men who breathed recycled air inside its hull, it was no ghost. It was home. They were the crews of K-64, K-316, K-432. The chosen few who served aboard the most advanced, most dangerous submarines ever conceived by the Soviet Union. Ride the pride of that service for a lifetime, the memory of commanding a machine that could outrun any torpedo in the NATO arsenal. A predator of the abyss. Others carried a different burden. A quiet, invisible decay in their bones. A sickness they swore was born in the shadow of the submarine's volatile heart. They fought a second, silent war in sterile bureaucratic hallways, battling for recognition, for compensation, for the simple acknowledgement that their service had come at a devastating price. A few put their stories to paper, desperate to document the paradox of their lives. Serving on a vessel of unparalleled speed and power, yet one that demanded constant, nerve-shredding vigilance to keep its own lethal energies in check. Today, the submarines themselves are almost all gone. Vanished. Their reactor compartments, once pulsing with unimaginable power, were surgically removed and disposed of with international aid. Their revolutionary titanium hulls, once the envy of the world, were sliced apart for scrap or left to bleed rust into the salt-scarred docks of the Kola Peninsula. Their lifeblood, the volatile liquid metal coolant, was drained and entombed, a toxic legacy awaiting a final, permanent solution. One still remains. K-123. A silent, toxic monument. Damaged in a reactor accident in 1982, it sits in a decommissioning facility, its hull intact, but its core forever sealed. It is a tombstone, marking the human cost of a technological dream. Plans exist for its final dismantling. This was the final testament of Project 705. It stood as irrefutable proof that engineering genius alone is not enough. The Soviets had built a miracle. A submarine that did everything promised. Over 40 knots, depths of 2,000 feet, automation that was decades ahead of its time. But performance specifications on a page failed to capture the brutal realities of military effectiveness. The maintenance was a nightmare. Operational availability was abysmal. The toll on crew health was catastrophic. The life cycle costs were astronomical. The Alpha class excelled at every metric except the one that truly mattered: sustainability. It was a technological sprint that ended in strategic exhaustion. The laughter that had first greeted intelligence reports of a 40-knot Soviet submarine died quickly in the hushed briefing rooms of the Pentagon. As evidence mounted, disbelief turned to alarm, and alarm to a feverish, multi-billion-dollar race to counter a threat that seemed to rewrite the rules of underwater warfare. But the final assessment was never a simple story of victory or defeat. The Soviets built something truly remarkable, a machine that ultimately proved too fragile, too demanding, too dangerous for the world it was meant to dominate. The West responded with a colossal expenditure that in the end proved unnecessary. Economic reality, not naval power, decommissioned the threat. The very same intelligence analysts who had correctly identified the Alpha's terrifying capabilities had also correctly identified its fatal operational flaws. Everyone learned a lesson. The battlefield beneath the waves was forever changed. And decades later, those who study the deadly art of submarine warfare still look back at the ghost of Project 705 and debate what it all truly meant. A pact with an unforgiving metal. A gamble measured in mountains of titanium and the very limits of human engineering. In the hushed corridors of Western intelligence, the initial reports were met with disbelief, laughter even. Then, the laughter stopped. It stopped the first time a ghost appeared on their sonar screens. An echo, moving at speeds thought impossible. A phantom of the deep that treated the it. For a fleeting, terrifying moment, the rules of underwater warfare were rewritten. But this victory was never clean. The machine was a marvel, yet it was also a monster. Brittle, deafeningly loud, and catastrophically expensive. Its heart was a reactor that demanded a terrible price from the men who served beside it. Achievement and limitation, welded together in a single, formidable hull. The true legacy was not the submarine itself, but the shadow it cast. A shadow that forced the hand of its rivals, spawning a new generation of weapons and tactics designed to hunt a ghost. The titanium gamble's echo outlasted the machine, reshaping the silent Cold War beneath the waves long after the last hull was retired.